We have a wonderful lineup of speakers for the final one because we think that this session matters very much. It really is at the heart of the matter, and it is critical for the world. And our speakers are from 4 different African countries. Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, and Ghana are well represented. For this discussion, I thought that we could draw on 3 threads that have emerged from our conversations over the last couple of days. The first one is the demographic potential of Africa, which we are all very familiar with. But just to bring up some numbers, the population is expected to reach 2.5 billion by 2050 from 1.4 billion today. It is the only region in the world which will actually have a population surge while populations will decline everywhere else. And that means that by 2035, there will be more young Africans entering the workforce each year than the rest of the world combined. So countries like China, Japan, South Korea, Europe, all of these will actually be facing a sharp decline in workers. Now, what does that mean? So Africa will play a role in not just global labor markets, but an important question really is, how does Africa generate a huge number of quality jobs for its youth? And for that to happen, the right investments need to be made in education, in skilling, in health, and in digital inclusion to strengthen human capital across the continent. And that brings me to the second thread, which is important to frame this discussion, and that is around the security development nexus that we find, which is deep-seated conflicts in parts of the continent, local insecurity, which is leading to forced migration and displacing communities, along with gaps in transport and energy infrastructure, which also hamper continental integration. The third part to this, of course, is Africa's rise in a multipolar world, its growing importance to geopolitics and geoeconomics. So with that, we will be looking at Africa's next-gen potential. Kayode, I'm going to start right away with you. With the broad framing question that 2025 has really been Africa's year in geopolitics, of course, the G20 presidency, the continent is indispensable for new economies, for governance. How do you think Africa can actually leverage this for actual bargaining power?
Thank you, Madam Moderator, and it's really wonderful to be back at the Cape Town conversation again. I want to join other colleagues in expressing thanks to ORF and to the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, particularly to President Mbeki. What history teaches us about Africa is that the periods where we have had historic social gains also coincide with periods of purposeful leadership on the one hand and Pan-African vision on the other, coming together. Whether you're talking about the first decade after independence, where the leadership was clear about the Africa's place in the world and purposeful in pushing for that decolonization agenda. Or you talk about the decade post-Cold War, where we also had leaders that were clear-sighted and focused on the place of Africa and how Africa needs to take charge. You also see considerable gain. That's the difference between the time when you talk about a hopeless continent, when we're having difficulties and challenges, which we still do, and Africa rising, Africa renaissance. That's the period President Mbeki was in office, President Obasanjo was in office, Bouteflika was in office, Abdoulaye Wade and Meles Zenawi, and the quartet, if you like, came together to drive the Africa's development agenda. So it means leadership matters. And two, that leadership in and of itself is not enough, as much as it matters, but when leadership combines with policy clarity, then tangible results can come. And that is also what I think we've witnessed with the G20 meeting that has just ended. in spite of the Afro-pessimism that attended the early days of that process, what we came out with was more of Afro-optimism, that Africa can be serious about its own agenda and can then bring others to see that seriousness and work together with us. So it wasn't really as if the declaration in its 122 paragraphs or 30 pages told us anything new about Africa in terms of what to do. But that reinforcing of the position of the continent and why Africa must have a seat at the table was important. That's what has been proven. But what is important in responding to your question is that if we're then to move from that, we need to ensure that we address the structural drivers of instability and insecurity on the continent. And the most critical of those structural drivers are poverty and inequality. So how we do that, yes, we talk a lot about and you've just done that as well. African population, youthful, dynamic, huge. But it's almost becoming a cliche, in my view, to keep reinforcing this thing about Africa's population. It's what we make of the population and how we ensure that the population serves its purpose of transformational development that would make the significant difference. And if Africa must have a seat at the table, African leaders must also win the hearts and minds of African citizens, majority of which are this youth. What we do in dealing with that, even in dealing with the skills that you're talking about, but skills alone will not do it. We have an opportunity to occupy that autonomous space to make a difference. One, with the population, we must be able, for example, to take advantage of the reduction that we're witnessing in other parts of the world. How do we do that? In terms of skills development, in terms of brain gain, in terms of remittance flow, in terms of labor mechanization, in terms of a whole range of things that we must do in order to make use of that population growth that Africa has an advantage over and above others.
Very important points that you've covered here. And I hope we get the time to actually talk a little more about those. But you've also given us the perfect segue for me to turn to Felani and really ask you again, the risk of the youth dividend turning into a lost dividend if the security development nexus is not addressed. And what do you think are the urgent steps for doing that?
So I think that's the key. I mean, if it's, on the one side, it is, yes, a dividend, and of course it is something that's positive. I mean, young people obviously bring a certain degree of energy. I think it's quite visible that, especially in a continent like ours, if you just do surveys, I think it's quite clear that despite, all the challenges that we face on the continent, overwhelmingly the most positive people with a positive outlook on the future are still Africans. That brings a certain degree of energy, but it also brings a certain degree of expectations. I mean, young people are not just, they're not resigned to their current realities. They want their lives to improve, and they don't want to wait for that improvement to come. They want it to happen now. They want to see visible signs of that. One of the key things that accompany this youth dividend is a urbanization trend. So if we look, up to 2050, the urban population from Africa will double, essentially. Some of the largest cities, some of the new cities that are going to be built in the next few decades are going to be cities in Africa. And the ability of urban spaces to absorb that movement of people into those cities is going to be key. Can those cities deliver services? Can they deliver jobs? Can those cities deliver quality education that equips young people for the jobs of the future? And not just for the jobs of the future, but to create the jobs of the future. So the environment that allows their entrepreneurship to actually thrive. I think this is what is key. So social cohesion is important. In the absence of social cohesion and with a young population and the urbanization trend, then you're basically setting up a recipe to turn a dividend into quite a difficult, situation. I mean, we've seen the protests in recent times, young people calling for better governance, calling for transparency, better services, less corruption. I think these are good, things that young people are injecting into the political economy within Africa. But the key, I think, is not to say that young people are the future. The reality is that on a continent where the vast majority of people are young, you can't say young people are the future. I mean, they outnumber, older people. So to say they're the future doesn't really make sense. You need to create the opportunities for them now, but you also need to give them the responsibilities to thrive. And I think that is what's going to be key, moving forward.
I agree. This panel is definitely not reflecting the age of Africa's population. But so two of the pathways. I'm really glad you mentioned urbanization, which perhaps has been under-addressed and is so critical to this. Two other things will play a very important part. One will be technology and the other will be skilling. And I'm going to ask first Priscilla to take on that question and then Del to come in on technology. But Priscilla, in yesterday's discussion also, we talked about the fact that we do have a situation where foundational skills are missing, but we also need populations to move to 21st century skills, which requires a huge amount of reskilling. So what should be Africa's strategies?
Okay, thank you so much. I want to actually start by saying we need to appreciate the governments for the work they've done in terms of skill development. And we have seen a lot of changes happening in the space of participation. If you think about early childhood education, think about general education, think about TVET, think about higher education, we're seeing these numbers going up and up. But the question is that quality education that we're actually providing? And employers are telling us it's not, because there's a huge mismatch between the skills that are gained in education vis-a-vis the skills that are needed for the 21st century. So the 21st century requires that individuals gain skills that are going to be creating opportunities for other people, skills that create innovation, and also skills that are going to be participating into the development of future technologies and future of work. And you said we talked about green skills, we talked about digital skills yesterday, we talked about entrepreneurship skills, and really about the future skills comes down to four things. So number one is about complex critical thinking, and this is about understanding how you can solve complex problems. It's about problem solving, it's about creativity and innovation, and the most important part is about agility, ability to learn. So that is becoming one of the most important skills, learning how to learn, because as you see, the world is changing quite fast. If you don't know how to learn, it's going to be hard. If you're going to apply ChatGPT on everything that you're working on, it's not going to solve any problems that you have. So governments have a lot of work in terms of policies and strategies. And the work that we do mostly, I work on TVET, and this is technical and vocational education and training, is just about understanding how governments can innovate for skills and jobs that don't even exist. And this is a big challenge because we are not even responding to the skills that are here today. So how are we going to innovate further? How can we anticipate the skills that are going to be for the future and the jobs? So I think I'm going to narrow down to a few policies that are important, or what we are seeing ministries are working on. Number one is about modality of how education is taking place. So think of dual TVET. So for people who understand technical and vocational, it's about getting the practical skills. So we are talking about the future going to be very green and digital, but at the same time, we still have practical skills that are needed. We need plumbers, we need electrical supplies, we need people who can work on different aspects like cooks and etc. So we need to develop this work-based learning where we work closely with the private sector to come up and combine the qualification standards as well as the occupational standards. So how are you going to do that? That is an important aspect. Then we need to understand the actual providers of education. So education is not going to be provided by governments only, but we're seeing a lot of informal education through multinational organizations. We have seen Microsoft has their own training. We are seeing this is competing with education system from the mainstream action. Formal education, non-formal education from NGOs and livelihood programs. So these are opportunities to understand how can we come up with policies that address these different modalities of education. Then another aspect that we're talking more about is about mobility. So we are working in countries that are now interconnected, and we're reducing borders. And we see that if you learn something in Kenya, you should be able to go and work in South Africa, and your qualifications are going to be recognized. So there's topics about recognition of prior learning, topics about harmonizing systems for education, that you're able to move to another country, you can move to Germany and be able to work there, and your qualifications from a university in Pretoria are going to be recognized. So that is a policy issue that needs to be tackled at the government level. And at the same time, we have to think about inclusion. So inclusion is an important policy, and it's one of the things that is repeated 3 times in the SDG 4. It talks about equality, inclusion, affordability, and these are important aspects when it comes to understanding policy. There are so many people who are excluded in the education system, whether they are persons with disability, they are people from refugee backgrounds. We are seeing women, we spoke yesterday about women, and we have different kind of people, including young people. So how do we ensure that inclusion is at the center of education system, and how do we provide training that captures this? And lastly is about data, and I'm going to say this because it's very important, because we are seeing multinationals are holding or taking data into account, because education systems don't have data. Without data, you cannot measure and you cannot improve. So you cannot improve anything that you can't measure. And data is going to be very important in the future of learning, because it allows us to come up with modalities and approaches that respond to the needs of the country based on evidence.
Yeah. So you ended at data. Del, it's time to bring you in. So Africa, or rather Rwanda, actually hosted a global summit on AI for Africa. And when we think about AI, I mean, the one question that comes, and also technology broadly, is the digital divide. But the other is the potential for leapfrogging that we are talking about as we talk about youth demographic. So how do you see AI transcending those gaps, the essential development gaps in health, in finance, in education? That's the first. And the second, also related to this, is that for all countries in the world, and including those in Africa, the world is looking at models for tech policy. The Chinese model, the American model are very opposing. What do you think should be Africa's model for that?
It's a really great question.
2 parts to it.
So I think, Africa needs to create a third lane. It should not be looking at the libertarian chaos in Silicon Valley or the command and control system in China. That's not what Africa needs to do. I think the focus for Africa really should be around the problems that we face. And as Priscilla mentioned, data is a key component to that. Because currently, if you even look at Web 2, the current infrastructure, when I say Web 2, I mean the current internet infrastructure that we have, foreign companies mine the data here for free, and then we rent it back, okay? So with that, that's a pernicious cycle. So we need to create a third lane, and some of these basics revolve around just basic language models. And sure, we have over 1,500, 2,000 languages on the continent. So we should be able to mine our own data, accurate data, and be able to convert them into local languages, right? And then we create autonomy around, like you said, education, justice, healthcare, etc. And so, now, don't get me wrong, there are some things we can learn from what the US has obviously done. They spearheaded this. But as I said, it's very important for Africa to identify its own problems and build accordingly. And then in terms of empowering the youth, it's not just as simple as, providing them the tools, right? And then just say, okay, let's scale this, right? We need to understand the dynamics of how our youth are most effective on the continent, right? For example, in my industry, which is mainly focused on the blockchain Web3 area, one thing that we've identified in Africa is around intellectual property. And intellectual property is something that we don't have enough control over because we just haven't got the digital infrastructure in place to ensure that we're protecting it and scaling it and licensing it appropriately, right? And so it's not copy and paste. Now, when I think of, the strides that are currently being made on the continent, there are some very positive strides in terms of the understanding of knowing where the future is going when it comes to industry around, or the technology industry. But at the same time, it's not just about leapfrogging. Leapfrogging, you do that, and part of learning is the journey of learning is what builds the plasticity, right? And so the way Africa needs to approach this is really data mine and understand its issues. And from there, we can build the strong foundations that institutions can build solid governance around, education systems. Curriculums should start implementing AI technology already. For example, with our business, we are already working with education and literacy programs with Binance and the government, right, to ensure that the future, we are where the ball is going to be, not where the ball is currently, right? So that's key. Our curriculum, right, should be implementing technologies of the future so that the youth is actually prepared and not in a situation where we're just literally throwing tools at them and we're saying, hey, scale this. That's just not going to work.
Okay, so I'm actually going to ask all of you one common question before we open it to the audience. Priscilla, you talked about mobility, how someone who is trained in South Africa should perhaps be able to go and work in Ghana. And that, I think, is a very important question about regionalization, and also how do we ensure that the continent has space for this? What is the role of strengthening something like the African Continental Free Trade Agreement? So if all of you can, from your perspectives and your work, just sort of tell us, how do you think that can happen? Let's go with you. And we need very short, crisp answers.
Really, regionalization really should be the new globalization, especially for us on the continent. And I think that's what the free trade agreement seeks to achieve. The challenge, of course, is not one of rejection of collective approach to development. It is the practical implementation that has really suffered. 50 out of 54 countries have now ratified the Continental Free Trade Agreement. But in practical terms, not much has happened. Even in areas where we have free movement of labor and goods, in the ECOWAS region. One gentleman spoke yesterday about the challenges that he faces traveling from Cote d'Ivoire to Ghana to Nigeria, and this is across the board. So leaders responsible for these need to really confront the monster of visa access on the continent. Because if you can't even move, you can't trade.
So infrastructure?
Infrastructure is a big issue that must be addressed. Both road, rail, and air travel is a challenge for Africans to move around. But beyond that, even trading amongst ourselves is another problem that hopefully, if we take the Continental Free Trade Agreement seriously, we'll be able to address. Some of the issues are being addressed. The payment system is now being addressed. There's a Pan-African payment system that the Afrexim Bank and a couple of other private sector operators are addressing now. But beyond that, governments also need to step up to the plate and reduce the difficulty of free movement on the continent.
All right. And you've also pointed out who the stakeholder is in this. Priscilla.
Yeah, I think I want to add on to that and take the education angle and look at it from education goes hand in hand with entrepreneurship and development of opportunities. So if you think about something like social media has really decentralized markets, and now we are seeing that supply chains end to end can actually be promoted by this harmonization of borderless kind of opportunities where the markets are opening through the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, and of course, working within the blocks. So when you compare this, and if you look at the issue of language, especially in education, it's very important to have like a same language where people can learn so that it's easy to actually compare the qualification standards because of the same language and the activities we're doing. So we are seeing that this is a common topic happening as a way for Africa, and I've seen a lot of countries have adopted Swahili to be an African language. It's still under debate, I don't want to put it down, but it's something that is going to be useful to have the same language that allows learners to really exchange more on peer learning and opportunities for education, and in the end, they can actually use the same language and currencies, maybe in future, to work on markets and opportunities in future. Yeah.
All right. Del, will that language be technology?
Say that, repeat that.
Will the common language be found through technology?
Biasly, yes, I would say that. And, you know, I think there is a component that I do want to bring up, which is very important around this whole technology aspect of things, is that if I look at, and I'm not being negative when I say this, I'm just being inward in terms of how we need to look at this going forward. Africa's GDP currently is stagnant, in my opinion. We have a lot of people, and mainly the youth, right? And so investing in the youth is ultimately investing in the future. So you just have to look at how the technology industry in other parts of the world has performed and the amount of economic prosperity it has brought onto those various markets. And then you need to look at where we are gaining our prosperity from and how we are investing into it. So it needs to be a redeployment of resources, right, in terms of where we are placing our efforts to make sure that we get the maximum economic prosperity going forwards, right? And that's heavily going to be centered around education data, as you mentioned, and governments really thinking about, or institutions really thinking about how they want to deploy their capital, right, and resources towards the youth and technology going forwards. And I think that that is actually what's going to change Africa's economic prosperity going forwards, and in exponentially, by the way. I think it would outperform every single industry bar agriculture, right? I think that's going to be what's going to really shift the ground beneath us. And as it stands today, it's still disjointed, it's extremely disjointed. And so that autonomy needs to be centered around education, and it needs to be centered around the redeployment of our resources in the right areas concerning technology. Not just AI, across board.
Philani.
Yeah, no, I think, colleagues have raised the issue of mobility across countries, across the continent, but internal mobility is also key. If there's rapid urbanization, the cities we're building have to be livable. So there has to be a massive investment in infrastructure. Physical infrastructure, the colleagues have raised the digital infrastructure also. This is an imperative, otherwise you're creating unlivable cities, and you're building up frustrations within those cities. At the same time, when we go, within the region, I think it's important to understand that regional integration is not a nice to have. It's absolutely fundamental, to maintaining a certain degree of Africa's strategic autonomy going forward. If we're only trading 20% of intra-Africa trade, then we need to operationalize, something like the African Continental Free Trade Area. I mean, you're talking about a massive potential in unlocking, our economies. But at the same time, I think we have to learn to also say no to certain proposals that come from outside the continent. And in fact, even certain investments. We need to be very precise. What are the type of investments we're looking for in the next 5 years, in the next 10 years? Do they align with our strategic objectives? If certain international actors are interested in pouring, resources into things that may not be in line with our current priorities, we also have to say no. Rather put resources into the areas where we are interested in at the moment. So I think that becomes important in order to develop those regional value chains that will create more job opportunities for young people on the continent, keep jobs here, but also build up our manufacturing capabilities.
That's very important. So I think all of you have done a wonderful job of keeping your answers very sharp and concise. There's so much still to unpack here. We have about a minute on the clock. And that just means I'm going to request you all to keep your questions very brief. And if we do not get the chance to answer, we will have all of them over lunch to have this discussion. Yes, Pranjal.
Good afternoon. 2013, it was in this hall that the WEF Africa was held, and I was here in this hall. And since then, some of the conversations still seem to continue. There was a talk about Cape Town to Cairo highway, and I wonder where that conversation is. And Fulani, I think you really hit it. Before any other thing, fundamental basic infrastructure, $1 trillion investment in roads, ports, highways is what is absolutely critical. One point, so I don't know where we are. One point which I think should be developed further is entrepreneurship. I think you cannot have pure jobs. You'll have to create entrepreneurship and create job creators. Before coming to Cape Town, this trip, I spent 3-4 days in Addis Ababa. I was very delighted to learn that, for example, they have 3 ride-sharing companies which have been locally created. There's no Uber. There are no European or American ride-sharing companies there. This is a great example. I don't know how many others there are in the continent, but that's a great heartening example for it. And I also learned that there are industrial corridors being built in Ethiopia, which is within. The point I'd like the panel to reflect on is, when will private capital be increased? Again, a question of decades. Fundamental investment in basic infrastructure, and third, entrepreneurship.
All right. Let's take the next one.
Okay. Thank you. My question is in relation to the dividend that we are proud of, which is about the youth. But my worry is on how fees across school fees, especially for university institution, how and why a student from Zambia would pay twice or thrice the fees in Zimbabwe or South Africa. When will we be able to actually reduce the cost of actually tuition, such that we have this Pan-African movement that we're saying we want to enable skills to actually flourish across the region? Thank you.
All right, John.
Good afternoon. Yes. My name is Samson Ajayi. So I don't want to overflow the concept of, Africa Rising. I think it's a concept that is already overflowed. However, the reality also is that a lot of African youths tends to be disconnected from the continent and would rather look for the quickest means to look for a better life. And we can make reference to most of the restrictions that they face in the politics and the likes. The question is, what are the governance innovations that can be introduced to make Africa more habitable and interesting to live for young Africans?
Okay. You picked the first one, the governance, and I can only give each of you 30 seconds. I'm sorry for that, but let's go with this.
We can have an extensive debate about that question, but what I can say is that the continent is not short of solutions that have been come about by the African Union. There's an African Union's common position on migration and development that speaks to the root causes of migration and why African youth find themselves jumping out of the continent, and also addressing what to do in order to achieve retention and capture value of our younger people on the continent. And the solution to it is what I said earlier. Our government, in order to get a seat at the table in this changing global order, must also respond to the immediate issue of winning the hearts and minds of the citizens of Africa. And you can't win their hearts and minds if you don't solve this lingering issue that you just talk about in a variety of sectors: agriculture, technology, you name it. And also, we have to address the old challenge of investing in the education. You spoke about higher education. We're training doctors, we're training nurses, we're training all these professionals practically free on the continent, who end up going to these Western capitals, and the continent loses out. So we need to find a way to redress that balance.
All right. Priscilla, the question on education, and very brief.
Yes, so the challenge of education and affordability is an ongoing issue that we see. And a lot of governments have actually started to implement free education, especially from early childhood all the way to higher education. But then there's a cost attached to it, and it depends on the government's ability to allocate a bigger budget that can support the education system within that country. And this is one of the areas that has not been really captured, because we still have trouble and problems when it comes to budgeting and, of course, other issues. So if we see international students coming to a country and they pay more school fees than than the nationals, it's not an issue of quality or anything. It's just a matter of an institution wanting to survive. And this is one of the areas that mobility policies can actually affect, to allow that this is harmonized and most students can be able to pay the same school fees, especially within the continent.
So mobility. Yeah. Perhaps.
That last one? Well, I guess a bit of both. On the youth front, I would actually like to reverse it. I think the bigger problem is we can't be electing 91-year-olds in Africa anymore. That problem has to go. That's the elephant in the room, that we have, majority of the countries have leaders that are too old.
Also India.
Right? And there's wisdom in age. There's no disrespect there, but we are at a different place, right? So that needs to change dramatically. Until that problem is solved, right, we're going to have the same problems going forward. And then when it comes to the entrepreneurship side, I guess probably need to harness some of the core needs, right? And then kind of simplify our approach on how we educate youth around that, opposed to, as I said, just throwing new concepts at the youth. We need to make what we already have efficient, right? And those basics, it's the basics we need to get in order before just leapfrogging and saying that, okay, more entrepreneurship programs. What are we doing with what we have already?
That's
right?
essential.
So that's it for me.
Philani.
Yeah, no, I think, we have to build on the basis of what we have, following on this comment. So we know we've got a massive informal economy. Instead of trying to make these businesses to fit into certain, degree of formality, work with what you have and try to scale it up. Rather enable those businesses to actually move up and become larger operations. I mean, when it comes to entrepreneurship, that's absolutely vital. I mean, the reality is that with this huge youth dividend that we have, not all these young people are going to be absorbed into jobs, but we need to find out how to ensure that they become net creators, of job opportunities. The last point here is that, the examples of Ethiopia and others, the Cape to Cairo sort of infrastructure investments. We need to also look that when it comes to financing, not all the financing is going to come from external actors. If we're going to wait for external financing, we're going to be waiting for a very long time. And that's not going to be good for the continent. I mean, you know, think about the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. You know, they got tired of waiting. They were denied funding from various structures, and they completely used a different funding model, including resourcing from domestic resources, the public servants, citizens, you know, contributing. But the key there is there has to be transparency in how those resources are actually utilized. And if there's transparency and if there's results, then society becomes more willing to actually chip in. I mean, we need to then also address your illicit financial flows. That is how you're going to unlock the resources that are already on the continent. And by doing that, you will attract more resources that come from external sources.
All right. Thank you so much for all of your insights. To be continued outside. All of our speakers will be available. I'm going to hand over to Pulkit.
Thanks, Unena. That was our closing plenary, NextGen Africa. Please join me in thanking our esteemed panelists and our moderator.